What is the price of a place in history? In an era where power was dictated by men, the cost was everything. It demanded you be the brain, the tireless campaigner, and the primary force behind a man. Ellen Axson Wilson paid that price. She was the quiet strategist and intellectual partner behind Woodrow Wilson's career, the indispensable force who guided him toward the presidency. The White House was the culmination of her life's work, but for Ellen it became the very place where her influence ended and her isolation began. She entered it as the First Lady, but just 17 months later, she died, her body worn down by a fatal illness, just as her true work had begun. But the cruelest irony was yet to come. History, as quickly as her husband found a replacement, erasing her to celebrate the shadow president, Edith Bowling. This woman's story began long before she ever set foot in the White House. Ellen Louise Axson was born on May 15, 1860, in Savannah, Georgia. This was not just the American South. This was the South on the absolute brink of self-destruction. Her birth came 6 months before the election of Abraham Lincoln, the event that would tear the fragile Union apart. The air in Savannah, a wealthy, humid port city built on the cotton trade, was thick with secessionist fever and the anxious, angry whispers of inevitable conflict. The Civil War was not a distant threat. It was breathing down the neck of her infancy. Her world, however, was not one of plantations and politics, but one of pulpits and piety. She was born into the very heart of the Southern Presbyterian aristocracy. Her family tree was not just a forest of theology, as the user noted. It was a forest of leaders. Her paternal grandfather, Isaac Stockton Keith Axson, was one of the most prominent Presbyterian theologians in the South, the revered minister of the Independent Presbyterian Church in Savannah. Her father, Samuel Edward Axson, followed this imposing legacy, becoming a minister in his own right, a man of deep intellect and profound, if ultimately fragile, sensitivities. Her maternal grandfather, Nathan Hoyt, was also a minister. This upbringing cannot be overstated. Ellen was raised in an environment that was intellectually rigorous, socially prominent within church circles, and defined by a powerful Calvinistic sense of duty. The Presbyterianism of her family was not a passive Sunday morning comfort. It was an all-encompassing moral framework. It taught that one's purpose on earth was not personal happiness, but to serve God's will, to fulfill one's duties, and to bear hardship with stoic, uncomplaining grace. This worldview was instilled in her from her first breath. It was the source of her profound sense of responsibility, her deep, abiding faith, and the reserved, almost stoic public demeanor that would later be mistaken for coldness. Her family soon moved from Savannah to Rome, Georgia, a smaller, picturesque city nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. This was the place she would always consider her true home. Here, she grew up not as a Southerner in the abstract, but as a child of the Confederacy's lost cause. She witnessed the devastation of the Civil War and the humiliation of Reconstruction. She saw her community and her family's world defeated, impoverished, and occupied. This experience of shared loss and resilience, of a proud culture forced into submission, further deepened her Southern identity and her quiet, observant nature. But from her earliest days, it was clear Ellen was different. She wasn't just a dutiful minister's daughter, destined to be a dutiful minister's wife. She possessed a deep, soulful, and prodigious talent for art. In an era when a woman's education was often a polite afterthought, a finishing that included a little piano, some French, and basic watercolor, Ellen pursued her passion with a quiet, burning intensity. She attended the Rome Female College in her hometown, a typical institution for young ladies of her class. but her talent was anything but typical. It was not a local curiosity. It was world-class. The proof came in 1878. When Ellen was just 18 years old, she submitted a freehand drawing to the Paris International Exposition. It is difficult to comprehend the audacity of this act. This was not a state fair. The Exposition Universelle of 1878 was the grandest spectacle on earth, a gathering of the globe's greatest achievements in science, industry, and culture. This was the event where the head of the Statue of Liberty was first displayed, where Thomas Edison's phonograph and Alexander Graham Bell's telephone wowed the world. And into this global arena, a freehand drawing from a teenage girl in small-town post-war Georgia was submitted. She didn't just compete, she won a bronze medal for artistic excellence. This was an astonishing validation. It was not a prize for being a good female artist. It was a prize for being a good artist, period. This single medal was a sign of a truly remarkable gift. It pointed toward a life that could have been dedicated entirely to the salons and studios of Paris and New York, a life as a professional artist, a peer of the American Impressionists she so admired. She had the talent. She had the validation. She had, for a brief moment, a path to a life of her own. But fate and family had a much crueler path in store. The dream of a life in art was about to collide with the unbending duty forged in her childhood. The first blow came in 1881. Her mother, Margaret Hoyt Axson, died shortly after childbirth, leaving behind her husband, a 21-year-old Ellen, two younger brothers, Stockton and Edward, and the newborn infant sister, Margaret, known as Madge. Suddenly, Ellen's life was overturned. She was no longer just an aspiring artist with a Paris medal. She was the de facto matriarch of a broken and grieving family. She put her artistic ambitions on hold instantly. Her dreams of studying at the prestigious Art Students League in New York were shelved. Her duty was clear. She had to manage her father's household and raise her siblings. It was a heavy burden, but she shouldered it with the stoic grace her upbringing demanded. This, however, was only the prelude to the real tragedy. Her father, the Reverend Samuel Axson, was shattered by his wife's death. He, a man of such exquisite, agonizing sensitiveness, as a contemporary described him, sank into a profound, suffocating depression. In the 1880s, there was no language for this, no effective treatment. There was only stigma and suffering. Mental illness, particularly in a man of God, a pillar of the community, was seen as a spiritual failing, a dark secret to be hidden at all costs. Ellen watched as her brilliant, beloved father unraveled. His melancholia, as they called it, deepened into a paralyzing despair. He was eventually institutionalized at the Georgia State Sanitarium in Milledgeville. For Ellen, this was a living nightmare, a constant vigil of hope and fear, all wrapped in a profound social shame that would have been suffocating. In 1884, the worst possible end came. While a patient at the sanatorium, Reverend Samuel Axson, died by suicide, we cannot overstate the impact of this. In the space of 3 short years, Ellen had lost her mother, become a surrogate parent, and now had to bear the almost unspeakable grief and social shame of her father's mental illness and death. In the 19th century South, the suicide of a minister was not just a personal loss. It was a public scandal, a theological crisis. It marked the family this crucible of tragedy forged the woman she would become. Her father's suffering and the helplessness she felt watching him instilled in her a deep personal empathy for the ill and the outcast. This was not a theoretical Christian charity. It was the raw, first-hand knowledge of human suffering. This empathy would one day drive her, as First Lady, into the diseased alleyways of Washington, D.C. The public nature of her family's collapse, the whispers, the stigma, likely forged her profound lifelong shyness. She was not just modest, she was, as she later confessed, morbidly shy. When you have weathered that kind of personal storm, the chatter of a drawing room seems impossibly trivial, and the glare of the public spotlight feels like a threat, an invitation for the world to scrutinize your private wounds. Above all, this period forged a quiet, resilient, unshakable strength. She did not break. She held her family together. At 24, she was now an orphan, the head of a household, responsible for the future of her 3 younger siblings. Her own dreams of being an artist, the life promised by that Paris medal, seemed dashed forever, a cruel joke from a past life. She was grieving, she was burdened, but she was resolute. Ellen Axson, orphaned and responsible for her siblings, stood at a crossroads. The life of an artist she had dreamed of, the life validated by a Parisian medal, seemed an impossible luxury, dashed by family tragedy. But her resilience, forged in that crucible of grief, had also created a woman of profound depth and quiet strength. It was this woman, not a flighty debutante, but a serious, tested soul, who would now encounter an intellect that matched her own, sparking a partnership that would define both their lives and ultimately a nation. It was in this state, grieving, burdened, but resolute, that Ellen Axson, in April 1883, encountered the man who would irrevocably alter the course of her life. She was 22 years old, visiting relatives in her beloved hometown of Rome, Georgia. Her mother was gone. Her father's mind was clouded by the melancholia that would soon claim his life, and she was the acting parent to her 3 younger siblings. Into the Presbyterian manse where she was staying paid a call a young lawyer from Atlanta visiting on business. His name was Thomas Woodrow Wilson. He was not the man we now picture. He was not the stern, bespectacled president of the wartime portraits. This was Tommy Wilson, a 26-year-old, gangly, intense, and not particularly successful lawyer. He had opened a practice in Atlanta, but his passion was not law. It was history, political philosophy, and oratory. He was, in his own words, a queer cub, full of nervous energy, intellectual fire, and soaring, almost messianic ambition. He was also, crucially, a product of the exact same world as Ellen. His father, Dr. Joseph Ruggles Wilson, was one of the most prominent Presbyterian ministers in the South, a close friend and theological colleague of Ellen's late grandfather. This was not a meeting of strangers. It was a meeting of 2 members of the South's tight-knit clerical aristocracy for Woodrow. It was instantaneous. He was utterly captivated. He saw in Ellen's pensive beauty, her quiet self-possession, and her obvious intelligence a perfect counterpoint to his own high-strung nature. He would later write that he fell in love with her in a single moment, struck by her unaffected grace and the most wonderful eyes in the world. For Ellen, it was a slower burn. She was drawn, not to his looks or charm, but to his powerful, restless intellect. In this intense, ambitious man, she recognized a mind as serious as her own. He saw her, not as a domestic ornament, but as an intellectual equal. This was the foundation of their bond. They were, as the original text noted, both people of the mind. A correspondence began, and their letters reveal a stunning intellectual partnership from the very beginning. This was no whirlwind, sentimental courtship. It was a rigorous exchange of ideas. They dissected books, debated political theory, and shared their deepest ambitions. Woodrow, who had decided to abandon his failing law practice to pursue a doctorate in history at Johns Hopkins University, poured out his plans for the future, a future in which he, from their very first letters, had already cast her as the leading lady. But Ellen Axson was not ready to be just a wife. The dream of art, the life promised by that Paris medal, was not dead. It was merely deferred. She was torn. She was deeply drawn to Woodrow's mind and his seriousness of purpose, but she was also in love with her art. In that era, the choice was stark and binary. A woman could be an artist, a bohemian, a professional living a life of the mind and the senses, or she could be a wife, a matriarch, the helpmeet to a great man's society, and particularly the rigid Southern Presbyterian society they inhabited dictated that she could not be both. After her father's tragic death in 1884, the burden of her family was fully on her shoulders. She could have sought the security of marriage immediately. Woodrow, now a graduate student in Baltimore, begged her to. Instead, in an act of remarkable independence, Ellen made a bold decision. She would not marry yet. She would go to New York City. She took her small inheritance and the proceeds from a family property sale and enrolled at the prestigious Art Students League. This was not a polite finishing school. This was the red-hot center of the new American art world. It was a buzzing, bohemian hub of creativity where radical ideas like Impressionism, just beginning to filter over from France, were being explored. She studied portraiture and landscape, working tirelessly, soaking in the energy of the city. She was finally living the life she had dreamed of. She was surrounded by other serious artists. Her work was praised, and she was thriving. She was an artist on her own terms in the greatest city in America. Yet, she was torn. The letters from Woodrow continued, passionate and intellectually dazzling. He was at Johns Hopkins, writing the doctoral thesis, Congressional Government, that would make him famous, and he missed her desperately. He needed her. She loved him, but she also loved this new, creative freedom. The choice she had to make was not just between a man and a career, but between two different versions of herself. Ellen the artist, independent and self-defined, and Ellen the partner, the intellectual and emotional anchor for a man she believed was destined for greatness. After a long engagement filled with soulful, agonizing letters, she made her choice. In 1885, she returned south and married Woodrow Wilson in her grandparents' home in Savannah. She had chosen love, duty, and partnership. She was putting her husband's career before her own. But as we will see, she never ever stopped being an artist. She simply channeled that same creative intelligence, that same discerning eye into a new medium, the shaping of a man and a presidency. The early years of their marriage were academic. Woodrow was not yet a politician. He was a professor. Their life was a quiet intellectual journey through a series of university towns. First was Bryn Mawr College, a new elite women's college near Philadelphia, where Woodrow was an associate professor from 1885 to 1888. Here, Ellen was surrounded by some of the most highly educated and progressive women in the nation, an environment that surely stimulated her own keen mind. From there, they moved to Wesleyan University in Connecticut, where Woodrow taught from 1888 to 1890. Finally, in 1890, they landed at his alma mater, Princeton University. This was where Woodrow truly came into his own, becoming the university's most celebrated professor. And Ellen was right there with him, but she was never a passive, tea-serving faculty wife. She was his active, indispensable intellectual collaborator. Her contribution was profound and concrete. When Woodrow's research required him to engage with dense German political science texts, Ellen, a minister's daughter with no formal training in the language, taught herself German. She did this not for pleasure, but for the express purpose of translating these critical academic sources for him, acting as his unpaid research assistant. When he wrote his great books and speeches, the ones that would build his national reputation. She was his first and most important editor. She didn't just check for grammar. She debated his points. She sharpened his arguments. She had an uncanny feel for his public voice, often encouraging him to soften his more severe academic prose and connect with his audience on a more human level. Woodrow, who could be rigid, self-righteous, and intellectually arrogant, relied on her emotional intelligence. She was his ballast. She was the one person who could critique him honestly, the one person who could manage his sensitivities, and the one person who truly understood the political implications of his words. During these academic years, their family grew. They had 3 daughters, all born in quick succession: Margaret in 1886, Jessie in 1887, and Eleanor in 1889. Ellen, with a flash of her dry Southern wit and a fierce loyalty to her origins, made sure to be in Georgia for the birth of her first 2 girls. She humorously but firmly insisted that her children would not be born Yankees. Her Georgia roots ran deep, a grounding force in their increasingly northern academic world. Her art, however, was relegated to the background. It became her private solace. She set up small studios in the attics of their academic homes, painting when she could, mostly landscapes and portraits in private. It was a passion, no longer a profession. Her primary role was now that of wife, mother, and intellectual partner. This partnership reached its first great political test in 1902, when Woodrow Wilson was named the first non-clergyman president of Princeton University. It was a role that thrust them both out of the quiet academic world and into a brutal public spotlight. It was here, in the gilded cage of the Princeton presidency, that Ellen first demonstrated her political genius. The Princeton years were, as the original text noted, a battlefield. Wilson was a reformer, a new man, determined to drag the sleepy, aristocratic, clubby university into the 20th century. His grand plan was to democratize the campus, primarily by abolishing the elite, fraternity-like eating clubs that dominated undergraduate social life and replacing them with more democratic quadrangles. The old guard, the wealthy, powerful alumni, the trustees, and the entrenched conservative faculty fought him at every single turn. Woodrow was a brilliant orator, but a terrible politician. He was combative, academic, and had a tendency to see every disagreement as a moral crusade. He made powerful enemies, believing that the righteousness of his cause was all that mattered. Ellen, however, was the opposite. She was the velvet glove on his iron fist. She understood, in a way he did not, that politics was not about abstract principles. It was about people. She became his chief strategist, his diplomat, and his damage control, all from the polite confines of the president's house. She hosted an endless, calculated stream of dinners, teas, and receptions. And she was not just a charming hostess. She was a political operator. She remembered every name, every family detail, every private concern of the trustees and faculty members. Her husband was alienating. She used her disarming Southern charm and, more importantly, her profound, genuine empathy to diffuse tensions. She would listen, truly listen, to Woodrow's opponents, making them feel heard, respected, and understood. While Woodrow was in his study writing broadsides against his enemies, Ellen was in the drawing room, charming them, finding common ground, and subtly building bridges. She read everything he wrote, every speech, every article, every letter. She had an uncanny sense for the political wind. She knew when he was being too harsh, when he was alienating a potential ally, when his own self-righteousness was undermining his goals. He relied on her judgment absolutely. More than once, a fiery letter written by Wilson in a fit of pique was quietly lost or held back by Ellen until he had cooled down. She wasn't just his wife, she was his most effective advisor. The dynamic perfected in the academic halls of Princeton, Woodrow the iron-willed idealist, Ellen the pragmatic human diplomat, was too potent to remain confined to a university politics, was the inevitable next stage. This partnership, tested by faculty feuds and alumni battles, would now be unleashed onto a far larger and more brutal stage. First, the corrupt political machinery of New Jersey, and then, in a high-stakes gamble, a deadlocked national convention that would decide the presidency itself. The brutal political battlefield of Princeton had been a proving ground. It had forged the partnership between the idealistic, combative Woodrow and the pragmatic, diplomatic Ellen into a formidable political weapon. He was the voice and the vision. She was the strategy and the steady hand. This dynamic, perfected in the cloisters of academia, was about to be unleashed onto the national stage. Woodrow Wilson's rise from this point was nothing short of meteoric, and at every critical juncture, Ellen was not just a witness, but a vital participant. In 1910, the political bosses of New Jersey's Democratic machine, looking for a clean, respectable, and supposedly naive puppet to front their ticket, tapped the high-minded president of Princeton to run for governor. They saw an academic, an orator, a man they could control. They failed to see the iron-willed Presbyterian crusader beneath the robes, and they completely overlooked his chief strategist, Ellen Woodrow Rand. And in a wave of reformist sentiment, he won. Ellen, for her part, had profound reservations. She loved the intellectual, cloistered life of Princeton. She cherished her art, her garden, and her family life, all of which she knew would be sacrificed to the pitiless publicity of politics. But she also believed, with an almost religious fervor, in her husband's destiny. She felt he was a man chosen by God to do great work, and her duty was to help him. Upon taking office in Trenton, Governor Wilson immediately did what the bosses had never imagined. He declared war on them. He turned on the very machine that had elected him, pushing a stunning agenda of progressive reforms, direct primaries, antitrust laws, and public utility regulation. It was Princeton all over again, but on a statewide stage. And just as at Princeton, Woodrow's combative, righteous indignation approach created powerful, bitter enemies. Once again, Ellen's role intensified. The governor's mansion became her new command center. While Woodrow battled the legislature, Ellen managed the human side of his administration. She was his sole confidant, the only person he trusted absolutely. She advised on appointments, mediated disputes, and hosted an endless series of carefully curated dinners, not for socialites, but for legislators. She was the one who smoothed the feathers her husband had ruffled, the one who translated his academic idealism into political possibility. She was, as the user's original text noted, the brain behind the governor. She was also the one who held him together. The stress of the office was immense, and Woodrow was prone to debilitating nervous illnesses and melancholy. Ellen was his rock, his nurse, and his emotional anchor, all while quietly running the political side of his life. He was so successful, so clean in a hopelessly corrupt system that almost immediately whispers began, could this one-term professor governor be the very man to break the Democratic Party's long losing streak for the presidency? The idea was audacious, almost absurd. Yet in 1912, he launched his campaign. This brought Ellen to the most critical, high-stakes political battle of her life, the 1912 Democratic National Convention in Baltimore. It was one of the most brutal and protracted conventions in American history. The convention hall was a sweltering cauldron of political warfare. The front-runner, Champ Clark, the Speaker of the House, had a clear majority of the delegates. But the Democratic Party at the time had a two-thirds rule. A simple majority was not enough. A candidate needed two-thirds of the delegates to win the nomination. Woodrow Wilson was the progressive alternative, but he was stalled. For ballot after ballot, he trailed and his support began to crack. The campaign was on the verge of collapse. His managers were exhausted and out of options. The key to the entire convention, the man who held its moral conscience in his hands, was William Jennings Bryan. Bryan, the great commoner from Nebraska, was a populist titan, a three-time presidential nominee, and a figure of almost religious adoration for the party's rural progressive wing. And he deeply distrusted Woodrow Wilson. He saw Wilson as everything he was not, a cold, severe, intellectual, East Coast elitist. Wilson, in his academic past, had even written dismissively of Bryan to Bryan. Wilson was not a true progressive. He was a Johnny-come-lately, a professor who knew nothing of the people's struggles. Wilson's campaign managers pleaded with Bryan, but their political arguments fell flat. The nomination was slipping away. This is where Ellen Wilson made her move. It was the perfect encapsulation of her political genius. She did not send a telegram. She did not draft a political argument. She did something far more powerful. She invited William Jennings Bryan to a private family meal. Imagine the scene. Away from the smoke-filled rooms and the screaming delegates, Bryan, the fiery populist, sat down at a simple dinner with the Wilson family. Ellen did not lobby him. She did not talk about delegates or platform planks. She did something Woodrow could never do. She connected with him on a human level. She spoke of their shared deep Presbyterian faith. She, the daughter of a minister, and he, the famously devout layman, spoke of God's will, of family, of their shared values, of their mutual belief that public service was a sacred calling. She humanized her husband, presenting him not as Professor Wilson, but as a fellow believer, a man of God, a good father, a man she, a fellow minister's child. Trusted historians credit that single quiet dinner as a critical turning point. It did not win Bryan's immediate endorsement. He continued to vote for Champ Clark for several ballots, but it thawed his icy reserve. It broke the personal animosity. It made him see Wilson differently. Ellen's quiet diplomacy had made Bryan receptive. Days later, as the convention remained deadlocked, Bryan made his move. Convinced that Clark was now in bed with the corrupt Tammany Hall machine of New York, Bryan dramatically switched his support, triggering an avalanche. On the 46th ballot, Woodrow Wilson, the man who had been on the brink of political oblivion just days earlier, won the nomination. It was a political miracle, and it had been engineered in no small part by the quiet, perceptive woman who knew that a shared prayer was more powerful than a political promise. In November 1912, Wilson won the presidency in a three-way race as the Republican vote split between incumbent William Howard Taft and the progressive icon Theodore Roosevelt. Ellen Axson Wilson, the shy artist from Georgia, the grieving daughter of a Presbyterian minister, was now the First Lady of the United States. She was, as she confessed to a friend, utterly terrified. "I am the woman with the least ambition in the world," she wrote. She did not dread the power, she dreaded the performance. She hated the spotlight, the ceremony, the social treadmill, the rigid formality that she knew would be a gilded cage. But she also saw something else. She saw a platform. And true to her nature, she had an agenda. When she moved into the White House in March 1913, her first act was not to plan an inaugural ball or consult with social secretaries. Her very first act was to inspect the third floor. She found a large landing, a solarium with good light, and immediately ordered that a skylight be installed. She was creating her own private art studio. This was her sanctuary. her non-negotiable room of one's own. It was a powerful symbolic act. She would perform the duties of First Lady, but she would not surrender her core identity as an artist. Here, in this bright private space, she returned to her first and truest love. She painted landscapes, many inspired by the art colonies, at Old Lyme, Connecticut, where she and other American Impressionists gathered. She was a gifted professional caliber artist, and her work was good. So good, in fact, that it was accepted into professional exhibitions, such as the prestigious Macbeth Gallery in New York. But here we see that profound conflict, that morbid shyness forged in her family's tragedy. She was the First Lady. She felt it was improper, perhaps even unseemly, to be seen as a professional artist trading on her name. So, when she exhibited her paintings, she often did so anonymously, or signed them simply as E.A. Wilson, to prevent her public role from overshadowing her art. She did not paint for fame or for money. She painted for her soul. But she did sell her work, often anonymously. And every single dollar, every last cent was donated to her chosen charities. Her art, once the focus of her youthful ambition, had now become a tool for her social conscience. And it was that conscience that would come to define her legacy. Soon after arriving in Washington, D.C., Ellen did something few, if any, First Ladies had ever done. She went for a drive. But she didn't tour the grand avenues, the monuments, or the wealthy neighborhoods of DuPont Circle. She ordered her driver to take her into the back alleys. At the turn of the 20th century, Washington, D.C., the grand planned capital of the nation, had a secret, hidden city tucked away behind the beautiful brick homes of senators, and the grand facades of government buildings were the alley dwellings. These were not simply poor neighborhoods. They were squalid, dilapidated shanty towns, crammed into the city's mews and backlots. They were a world apart, invisible to the powerful men who ran the country. These alleys lacked running water. They had no sanitation, with entire communities sharing a handful of overflowing, foul-smelling outdoor privies. They lacked basic ventilation and were packed with families of 8, 10, or 12, living in single, crumbling rooms. Disease, tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera was rampant, and child mortality was staggering. These slums were populated almost exclusively by the city's poor African American and immigrant communities, trapped by racist housing covenants and economic neglect. Ellen Wilson, the minister's daughter who had witnessed the depths of human suffering in her own father's decline, was appalled. The word horrified does not do it justice. She was morally outraged. This, she declared, was a disgrace to the nation's capital. She didn't just write a check. She didn't just form a polite committee. Ellen Wilson, the First Lady of the United States, got out of her car. She walked through the filth. She stepped into those dark, airless homes. She spoke to the residents. She saw with her artist's eye the human dignity struggling to survive in the midst of inhuman conditions. This was not a photo opportunity. This was a private, searing experience. And then she got political. She returned to the White House, not as a shell-shocked philanthropist, but as a crusader. She had found her mission. The shy artist now had a very public, very unglamorous, and very political fight on her hands. The discovery of the alley dwellings was not a passing moment of pity for the new First Lady. It was a profound moral catalyst. The shy private artist who had hidden her work under a man's name now found a cause that eclipsed her own morbid shyness. Ellen Wilson's horror at the sight of Washington's alley dwellings was not a fleeting, sentimental pang of pity. It was a call to action. The shy private artist, the woman who had spent decades mastering the art of quiet influence, now transformed into a focused, relentless, and brilliantly effective public lobbyist. She had a mission, and she was, for the time in her life, utterly devoid of shyness. She was, as one observer noted, a crusader. She understood power. She had watched her husband wield it, and she had quietly directed it herself for years. She knew that a polite letter to a committee or a charitable donation would accomplish nothing. These conditions had existed for decades, festering just blocks from the Capitol, precisely because they were invisible to the men who held the power to change them. Her strategy, therefore, was simple and devastating. She would make them see. She began a campaign of what can only be described as strategic high society shaming. She did not just send reports, she used her unique position as the nation's hostess. She invited senators, she invited congressmen, she invited the city's most powerful socialites and philanthropists. And then she took them on tours. Imagine the scene. A group of powerful, wealthy, white politicians, uncomfortable in their fine wool suits and starched collars, being led by the quiet, graceful, and immaculately dressed First Lady of the United States through the ankle-deep mud and filth of the city's worst slums. She made them stand in the stench of open sewage. She guided them into the dark, single-room shacks where tuberculosis was claiming whole families. She made them see the sick, listless children with her artist's eye for unignorable detail. She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. Her very presence, her calm, resolute dignity in the face of such squalor, was a more powerful indictment than any fiery speech. She shamed them with the truth. This was not a one-time event. It was a sustained personal lobbying effort. When the tours were done, the political work continued at the White House dinner table. This was her true battleground, the place she had perfected her craft at Princeton and in Trenton. While her husband, President Woodrow Wilson, was consumed with his new freedom agenda, battling Congress over the massive Underwood-Simmons tariff, the creation of the Federal Reserve System, and the Clayton Antitrust Act, Ellen was waging her own parallel war. She would carefully study the guest lists for state dinners. She would identify a key senator, one who was on the fence about her project, and seat him next to her. She would charm him, listen to him, speak of his family and his home state, and then, at the opportune moment, she would turn the conversation with her quiet, unshakable conviction to the alley dwellings. She would make her case, not with statistics, but with the human stories she had seen, the faces she had memorized. Woodrow Wilson himself marveled at her skill. He once praised her as a wise wife, admitting to his cabinet that Ellen had used her influence at a dinner to bring wavering lawmakers in line on his own tariff bill. Now she was using that same formidable skill for her bill. The legislation she championed was formally known as the Alley Clearance Act, though it became known in the press simply as Mrs. Wilson's bill. The bill's goal was simple, bold, and reflective of the progressive era's mindset. It would authorize the federal government to use the power of eminent domain to seize these alley properties, demolish the slums, and build model houses, sanitary, livable homes with running water, light, and air in their place. This is, without question, the cornerstone of her legacy as First Lady. But as we look back from the 21st century, the story is, as the user's initial prompt requested, one of profound historical complexity. To the white reformers of 1913, Ellen Wilson was a saint. She was a benevolent angel of mercy, cleaning up a blight, bringing light into darkness. But the story, and the bill itself, was far more complicated and deeply flawed. The bill was an early and defining example of urban renewal, a concept that would have devastating consequences for minority communities throughout the 20th century. The bill's primary goal was slum clearance, but it gave very little concrete, funded thought to the people living in those slums. The residents of the alleys, almost exclusively African American, were not consulted. They were the objects of the reform, not the partners in it. Critics, both then and now, point out that while the intention may have been benevolent, the practical impact was displacement. The bill authorized the destruction of their homes, but it had no concrete, funded one-to-one plan for where these thousands of displaced residents would go. It threatened to destroy established, albeit poor, communities with their own churches, social networks, and support systems under the guise of sanitation. Furthermore, the entire effort was rooted in the paternalistic and often racist assumptions of the progressive era. The language used by reformers, though not necessarily by Ellen herself, described the alleys as sources of disease, crime, and moral contagion, a blight that threatened the surrounding white neighborhoods. The focus was on cleaning the city, which was seen as synonymous with removing the unclean populations. It was a top-down solution that saw the residents as a problem to be managed, rather than as victims of systemic neglect, racist housing laws, and economic exploitation. Ellen Wilson was a product of her time. She was a white, upper-class Southern woman from the 19th century. Her response was one of genuine, deep-seated empathy, an empathy born from the crucible of her own family's suffering. She saw the filth and the sickness, and her solution, the only one her era offered, was to tear it all down and build anew. It was a bold, unprecedented act of social reform for a First Lady, but it was not a modern act of social justice. It was a complex, imperfect, and controversial effort by a woman who was, nonetheless, genuinely moved to act when all others had looked away, and her fight for this bill was not happening in a vacuum. Her 17 short months as First Lady were a whirlwind of activity, a life lived at a desperate sprint. While lobbying for the Alley Clearance Act, she was also pursuing other quieter reforms. She was horrified by the working conditions for federal employees, particularly the sanitation in public buildings, and successfully campaigned for improvements. She took a deep personal interest in child labor reform, and most poignantly, the care of the mentally ill, a cause that surely resonated with the woman whose father had been lost to that very system. In the midst of all this, the painting in her studio, the lobbying in Congress, the tours of the slums, she also left one of the most beloved and lasting physical marks on the White House itself. When she arrived, she found the patch of land outside the president's office to be unremarkable, a simple colonial-style garden. She had a different vision. With her artist's eye, she sketched out a new, more formal plan. She collaborated with landscape architect George Burnap, envisioning a stunning, symmetrical garden defined by sharp, elegant lines, boxed hedges, and most famously, a profusion of roses. The result was the White House Rose Garden, a space that would become synonymous with the presidency itself, the most famous and iconic garden in the nation. It was her artist's soul leaving its permanent, orderly, beautiful mark on the public landscape. And, as if her schedule were not full enough, she also presided over a period of intense joy and activity within the White House walls. The Wilsons were the first family since Ulysses S. Grant to have all their children living with them in the White House, and Ellen, a fiercely devoted mother, was determined to give them a happy home. In her 17-month tenure, she planned and hosted 2 spectacular White House weddings, the great society events of their day. First, in November 1913, was the wedding of her middle daughter, Jessie, to Francis Bowes Sayre. It was a grand affair, the first wedding in the White House in 8 years. Then, just 6 months later, in May 1914, her youngest daughter, Eleanor, married the much older Secretary of the Treasury, William Gibbs McAdoo. It was another stunning event, cementing the Wilson White House as a place of family, youth, and celebration. But photographs from Eleanor's wedding in May 1914, when studied closely, show a First Lady who looks pale, drawn, and painfully frail. The joy of the occasion, the second in a year, was overshadowed by a secret she and her inner circle were desperately keeping. Ellen Wilson was dying. For months, she had been suffering from terrible, persistent back pain and a bone-deep fatigue. She dismissed it as exhaustion. She was, after all, running the White House, planning 2 weddings, lobbying Congress, and painting in her studio. Who wouldn't be tired? But in March 1914, just before Eleanor's wedding, she fell. It was not a simple trip. It was a collapse. Her illness could no longer be hidden or dismissed. She was diagnosed with Bright's disease, a 19th century term for a chronic and fatal kidney ailment, likely chronic nephritis. In 1914, it was an incurable, agonizing, and irreversible death sentence, a fatal diagnosis, a stalled piece of legislation, and the outbreak of a global war. These 3 threads of crisis converged on the White House in the stifling summer of 1914. As the armies of Europe mobilized, Ellen Wilson began her own race against time. The shy woman who had dreaded the spotlight was now at the center of a profound personal and political drama, her life's work hanging in the balance as her husband was forced to divide his attention between a dying world and his dying wife. The first week of August 1914 was one of the most cataclysmic in human history. The guns of August were booming across Europe as the great powers, locked in a rigid dance of alliances and ambitions, plunged the continent into the abyss of the Great War. Downstairs in the White House, the telegraph rooms were clattering incessantly with coded cables from Berlin, London, and Paris. Germany had declared war on Russia and France. Its armies were smashing into neutral Belgium, and Great Britain had just committed its global empire to the fight. The world was on fire. Upstairs in the hushed, stiflingly hot residential quarters, President Woodrow Wilson was trapped in a separate, agonizing crisis. His wife, his partner, his most trusted counselor, Ellen Axson Wilson, was slipping away. He was a man torn between 2 duties: the public, global cataclysm that demanded his full attention, and the private, personal collapse that was shattering his entire world. He would sit by her bedside for hours, holding her hand, then be called away to an urgent cabinet meeting about global neutrality, only to rush back to her room. By August 6, 1914, the end was near. Ellen was 54 years old, but the ravages of Bright's disease, the fatal kidney ailment, had left her emaciated and weak. She was slipping in and out of consciousness. Her personal physician, Dr. Cary Grayson, who was a constant presence, knew it was a matter of hours. President Wilson sat by her side, his grief immense and palpable. This was the man who just a year earlier had told a friend, "My wife is the most wonderful woman in the world. It is a literal fact that I am not in the least conscious of having a separate thought from her." He was not just losing a wife, he was losing his anchor, his ballast, the emotional and intellectual bedrock upon which his entire life was built. He was, as he would later confess, terrified of functioning without her. In a moment of pained lucidity, Ellen rallied. Her eyes focused, and she saw not the global crisis, but the one small, unfinished piece of her own work. She turned her head weakly toward her husband. Her voice was barely a whisper. She was obsessed with her alley dwelling bill. It had passed the Senate, but was stalled in a House-Senate conference committee, tangled in the procedural arguments and apathy of a Congress anxious to adjourn for the summer. She made him promise. With the last of her strength, she fixed him with her gaze and made him promise her that the bill would pass. For Wilson, this was a sacred final command. Frantic, he bolted from her bedside. He did not delegate. He, the President of the United States, in the very midst of the outbreak of the World War I, got on the telephone. He began calling key members of Congress directly. The message he delivered was not political, it was primal. It was a raw human plea. He told them the First Lady was dying. He told them her last conscious thought, her final wish on this earth, was for them to pass this one unglamorous bill. The news spread through the Capitol like a shock wave. The political squabbling, the apathy, the procedural arguments, it all evaporated. The message was simple and undeniable. The president's wife is dying, and this is the only thing she wants. That same afternoon, in a stunning, unprecedented gesture of respect and sympathy, Congress broke the deadlock. Both the House and Senate passed the final conference report by unanimous consent, sending the bill to his desk. The news was rushed back to the White House. A messenger delivered the word to Dr. Grayson, who immediately went to Ellen's bedside. He leaned over her, taking her hand. She was now barely conscious, her breathing shallow. He told her quietly but clearly, "The bill is passed." According to Dr. Grayson, a faint, perceptible smile flickered across her face. Her work was done. She had held on for this. But her work, as it turned out, was not quite done. She had one final, pragmatic, and heartbreakingly selfless instruction to give. She knew her husband. She knew his nature better than he knew it himself. She had seen what her father's melancholia had done to him, and she recognized that same profound, suffocating sensitivity in Woodrow. She knew he was a man who needed a partner, a man who could not and should not function alone. She knew that his rigid Presbyterian morality, his deep-seated sense of duty and loyalty would imprison him in his grief, that he would feel it was a betrayal to ever love again. So she performed her final act as his partner. She turned her eyes to Dr. Grayson. "If I should die," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible, "promise me you will tell Mr. Wilson that I hope he will marry again." It was an absolution. It was an instruction. It was her final selfless act of political and emotional management, freeing him from the guilt she knew would cripple him. She was, in her final moments, still the ballast, still the strategist, thinking not of her own soul, but of his future, of his ability to carry on the work she believed God had destined him. For a few hours later, in the early evening of August 6, 1914, with Woodrow Wilson holding her hand, Ellen Axson Wilson died. The nation was plunged into mourning. Her body lay in state in the White House East Room, the very room where, just months before, she had presided over the joyous wedding of her daughter, Eleanor. The contrast was devastating. The very next day, August 7th, while his wife's body lay in state, a shattered Woodrow Wilson walked to his desk. With a shaking hand, he performed his last official act for her. He signed the Alley Clearance Act into law. It was her bill, her legacy, her final victory. After her funeral, she was taken by train back to her girlhood home of Rome, Georgia, and buried among the family she had lost and loved so deeply. Ellen Wilson's death devastated her husband. He was plunged into a depression as dark and suffocating as the one that had claimed her father decades earlier. "Oh my God, what am I to do?" He wept to Dr. Grayson. He wrote to a friend that his life was crushed and that he would go on, mechanically no doubt, and do my duty, but it will be only the performance of a task. The light, the heart, the brain of his operation was gone. And then the world exploded. The Great War began in earnest. The sinking of the Lusitania, the battles of the Somme and Verdun, the debates over neutrality, and America's eventual entry into the conflict. This global thunder completely overshadowed the quiet, brief tenure of the First Lady, who had died at its outset. Her legacy became a footnote. In the grand tragic sweep of the 20th century, Ellen Wilson was forgotten. She became simply the first wife, the tragic, gentle invalid who died before the real story began. She was remembered, if at all, for two pretty domestic things: the White House Rose Garden and the two White House weddings. But her true impact, her real story, was so much deeper, so much more complex. Ellen Axson Wilson was a profoundly transitional figure in the history of the First Ladyship. She was not a modern, activist First Lady in the mold of her successor, in all but name, Eleanor Roosevelt. She never gave a press conference. She never made a public speech on a political topic. She never openly challenged the social boundaries of her time. She was, in every outward appearance, a 19th century woman, a perfect minister's daughter, a helpmeet to her husband. But she was not a passive hostess. She was perhaps the First Lady to use the tools of the 19th century feminine sphere to achieve concrete 20th century political goals. She operated from behind the scenes, using the power of the dinner table, the private conversation, the gentle suggestion, and her own disarming, quiet empathy as political weapons. She was a brilliant political operator who understood that power does not always need to roar. It can whisper. It can persuade. It can, with quiet, unshakable dignity, lead a group of stubborn, powerful men through the mud to force them to see a truth they would rather ignore. Her life was a study in profound contradictions. She was a daughter of the Old South, a Georgian to her core, who nonetheless became a passionate progressive reformer, fighting for federal power to be used to help the most marginalized, primarily African American communities in the nation's capital. She was a world-class medal-winning artist, a gifted American impressionist with a professional caliber talent, who was so morbidly shy that she exhibited her work anonymously or under her initials. She was a quiet, private, intensely shy woman who dreaded the spotlight. Yet she found the courage to become a brutally effective public lobbyist, a crusader who bent Congress to her will. Even her greatest victory, the Alley Clearance Act, is part of this complexity. While it was a landmark in terms of a First Lady's direct legislative involvement, its practical legacy was flawed. The bill was underfunded, and with the war's onset, it was quickly sidelined. The slum clearance it authorized did, in later years, lead to the very displacement its critics had feared, becoming a model for the flawed urban renewal projects of the mid-century. Her intentions were pure, born of a deep empathy, but the solution was a product of her time, paternalistic and incomplete. In 2000, she was inducted into the Georgia Women of Achievement, a fitting, if long overdue, honor for the first Georgia native to ever serve as First Lady. Ellen Wilson's story is not one of glamour or public ambition. It is a story of resilience, the resilience of a young woman who weathered unimaginable personal tragedy, the death of her mother and the suicide of her father, and emerged not broken, but forged into steel. It is a story of quiet, profound influence, of an artist's eye and a political brain operating in perfect, secret synthesis. And above all, it is the story of a deep, abiding empathy, born from her own suffering, that she successfully channeled into a force for political change. She was the brain and the heart of the Wilson White House. And she is perhaps the most influential First Lady you've never heard of.